So we're going to continue now in Masechet Yoma on Daf Lamed, and we started with the statement of Rav Papa, and Rav Papa said that if he has Soa in the Piyat Habas, then he's not allowed to recite Kriyat Shema. And the Gemara said that, wait a minute, if he can't see that Soa, then we should apply the principle Lo Nitna Torah LaMalachi Asharis. The Malachi Asharis don't have the problem of that filth and that excrement. And the Gemara answers that it's Nireis Yochev, but Eino Nireis Omed. That if he bends his body in that way by sitting down, then the Soa, that last bit of Soa, will come out and it'll be Nireis. And therefore, even though he's standing and he can't see the Soa, but it's, he could feel that it's pushing out, then he's not allowed to read Kriyat. Maishna mitzoa al besara. So let's just see where we're up to for today. We're on Daf Lamed, and we can count down approximately, shall we say, 10 lines down. The line starts with the word Venires, and if you move your finger across the line, umaishna. Maishna mitzoa al besar de itmar, tzoa al besaro, o shahayadav bebeis hakise. Rav Huna Omar muto likros kriyat shema. Rav Chizda Omar also likros kriyat shema. Now Rav Huna and Rav Chizda are debating which pasuk, both psukim, are in the same chapter of Tehillim, and which pasuk is going to teach me the laws of Tzoa. Rav Huna based himself on the pasuk Kol haneshama tahalel ka, and the word neshama refers to neshima, taking a breath, and that refers to the mouth and the nose, the nostrils. These are the organs of the body that are in charge of breathing, of taking air in. That's called kol haneshama tahalel ka. So that these organs, the nose and the mouth, are singing praises to God in David HaMelech's formulation of Kol HaNeshama Ta'al Kol. And therefore, we only need Nikius. We only need to cleanse to guarantee the cleanliness of those two organs when we sing the praises of God. So therefore, if there's Soa on another part of his body, let's say he has Soa on his legs, for example, or if he places his hand inside a Beis HaKiseh, and we assume that he may have had some contact with Soa. It's not like today's bathrooms, where you just flush it. In those days, there was an accumulation of excrement. So if Huna says he's allowed to read Kriyat Shema. Why? Because those organs of the body are not part of Hilul, the Hallel. And if they're dirty, they're filthy, or they entered into a place that's filth, that's not going to in any way inhibit his ability to be Mahalel, because it's Kol HaNeshama Ta'al Kol. And Neshama refers to Neshima, to the peh, and to the nostrils, the reach, the smell, the chotem. Rav Chizda has a different pasuk in the same exact context. David HaMelech says, "Kol atzmosai tomarna Hashem mikamocha." All the organs and all the bones of my body gather together to recite your praises. The whole guf participates in Hilul, and therefore the entire guf requires Nikiyus according to Rav Chizda. Now, what we have to ask is the following. According to Rav Papa, who says that the entire body has to be clean, and Rav Huna disagrees. Rav Huna is matir kriyat shema in the case of Toa al Besaro al Gufo. Now, Rav Chizda only prohibits kriyat shema in the case of Toa al Besaro because of the pasuk Kol Atzmosai Tomarna. But if not for that, let's say, for example, if he has, a little bit of tzoa in his piyat habas, and it let's say gives off an odor, then that itself would not disqualify him from reciting kriyat shema. It's only because of this pasuk Kol Atzmosai Tomarna. So why is it that in the case of tzoa al Besaro, Rav Huna says you're allowed to read kriyat shema? Rav Chizda would have said you're allowed to read kriyat shema except for the pasuk Kol Atzmosai Tomarna. But we just finished saying, in the name of Rav Papa, that if he has tzoa b'piyat habas, he's not allowed to recite kriyat shema. Certainly doesn't square with Rav Huna, who says that all that we care about is the peh and the chotem, and it doesn't even square with Rav Chizda because Rav Chizda has a special pasuk of Kol Atzmosai. But you're telling me that if there's tzoa in his piyat habas, that itself is an oser that generates an isur for him to say kriyat shema because of the filth that's in his piyat habas. So the Gemara answers, bimkoma nafish zuama, shalom bimkoma lo nafish zuama. That when the excrement comes out of the anus, it has a very strong odor. When it gets smashed on other parts of the body, it doesn't have that same strong odor. And that's called low nafish zuama on the rest of the body, and nafish zuama when it comes out of the piyat habas. So when the tzoa comes out, it hasn't really been exposed to air, and therefore the smell of the tzoa is very sharp, is very profound. On the other hand, when it falls or gets smeared on any part of his body, it's already been exposed to air, and it doesn't have that same strong zuama, that same strong reach. Okay. Now the Gemara wants to know about cleanliness with regard to seuda, with regard to eating a meal. Tana Rabbana, halacha b'seuda, the laws of seuda require that adam hayotze lahashtin mayim, if a person has to urinate in the middle of the meal, notel yado achas, all he has to do is wash one hand, and that's the hand that he used. You remember we said that after a person urinates, there are drops on his leg, and he has to wipe them off. That he's going to do with one hand, whichever hand he uses, and that hand requires netilas yadayim for the giyus. And v'nichnas l'suda, and then he comes back and he finishes his meal. However, diber im chavero vehiflig, if he goes out of the Suda and he meets a friend of his and he has a long discourse with his friend, then when he comes back in, he needs a new netilas yadayim. Now it's not a matter of the kiyus, it's a matter of netilas yadayim. Netilas yadayim is an entity, an enterprise that means he has to wash both his hands. So again, how long did he leave the Suda? In Rashi, it says Shah Achas. I don't know exactly what Shah Achas means. It means 60 minutes or even less than 60 minutes. But in any event, he had what's called Hesech Hadas. He got so involved in this discussion with his friend they're talking about a major investment, or I don't know, talking about the latest news on the government, on Corona, whatever it might be. So in that case, he has Hesech Hadas. Hesech Hadas means that you don't know where your hands moved around. You're not even paying attention. We have a principle called Yodayim Askonios, that unless you're careful and you pay special attention to where your hands are moving, we assume they go anywhere. And they could have had contact with any part of your body, which is Makomos Mechusim, and therefore your hands are no longer, there's no longer Shmiras HaYadayim. So these are the different dinim. Once again, if he's using a hand to clear off his urine, that hand needs nikiyus. It has to be washed. But again, he went to urinate and he's coming immediately back to the Suda. There was no Hesech Hadas. But if he ups from the Suda for a long discussion with his friend, that's called Hesech Hadas. He has now disqualified himself as far as the original Netilas Yadayim. He needs a replacement Netilas Yadayim, and he'll have to wash both his hands. Ukshunotel Yadav. Now, where is he washing his hands? Is it in the public eye, or does he do it privately? Like, for example, I can give you, in modern times, we have sinks that are inside what we call an ulam smachot, or sometimes the sinks are located outside the ulam smachot. And all this is relevant to our discussion here. Why? Because kshunotel, when he washes his hands, lo yitol mimachutz the kanes, we're not going to allow him to wash his hands outside of the dining area. We want a public act of washing his hands. Why? Because otherwise, that those who are in the Suda, they don't know that he washed his hands. They are going to suspect him of returning after a long period of hiatus in which he wasn't there, and he's eating without Netilas Yadayim. That's called chashad. And it could be that, again, this is just Berzon talking, that there's an element here of imitating someone else. We're not only afraid of people suspecting him, which is bad enough, but they may want to imitate him. They're saying, well, he didn't wash his hands. Why would I have to wash my hands? Now, again, I don't know if in our context, contemporary life, we would have to go this far, but in the life back in the time of the Talmud, in order to guarantee that everyone who's eating together with him in that dining room realizes that he was notel yadayim, what he has to do is sit down at his place, and he or somebody will bring him over, a basin of water, and he'll do netilas yadayim mamish as a public demonstration. And what he does is he now presents this netila, in other words, the sefel, the receptacle, and he passes it on to the other guests who are eating at the same suda, and he has to ask them the following question: is there someone here who's participating in the suda who needs the netilas yadayim? He is really now involved in almost an educational procedure. Lodia shezeh nichlas achshav natal es yadav. If we're going to make a whole public display about it, passing it around, so that everybody knows that so and so left and now he came back and he washed his hands. And is there anyone else who needs to wash his hands? And whenever I see this Gemara about Chashad, I always tell the story. I don't know if it's true, but that's the story they tell about Rav Moshe Feinstein, that when he participated in an Aguda convention, which was always held in the fancy hotels, and on Shabbos, which he wasn't so thrilled about, they used to offer in the coffee room, they would offer cakes, the fancy cakes. Now, davening was, let's say, at 9 a.m. Shabbos morning. And Rav Moshe was sitting there having a cup of coffee and eating from these cakes, and it was 8:30 a.m. So Rav Moshe asked his second his second in command to bang on the table and make an announcement that Rav Moshe had davened in the early minyan. They had a vasik minyan to make sure that nobody suspected him of eating cake before davening. So that's called chashada. Here also, no one knows that this fellow washed his hands for the Suda, and therefore we want to make a public display out of it. Omer Rav Chizda, Lo Amaran, when do we say that we require this publicity in the washing of his hands? Ella lishtos. If he had already completed his meal, and now he wants to come back and just drink something. Because it was quite common in those days that after the meal, they would drink a lot of liquids. And now we require him, when he's coming back just for shtia, just for drinking purposes, to wash his hands, because we're always afraid that since the food and the bread is on the table, again, he had finished his meal, he had eaten enough, but he wants to come back and drink. He wants to have a tea at the end of his meal, whatever he wants, that he might come in contact with the bread that's on the table and decide, you know what? Why don't I grab another piece of bread? I mean, I washed, I didn't bench it, so I'll grab another piece of bread. Avolecho, no one would suspect him if he comes back and continues eating his meal that he didn't wash his hands. That far, there's no chashad. They could suspect him of fitting this profile where he didn't have any intention to continue his meal and eat any bread. His intention was to drink at the end of the meal, which was part of their, their etiquette, their society. And then he grabs a piece of bread. Oh, that's not good. People are going to start suspecting him. He didn't wash his hands. Now we're going to require a public demonstration that he washed his hands. But if he comes back and he eats his meal, no one would suspect him of eating a meal of bread without washing. Therefore, Avalechel, if he comes back to eat his meal, to continue his meal, notel yodam mibachutz v'nichnas, he can wash his hands privately, enter into the Chadar Ochel, and may the yodi danina daite. Everyone knows that he washed his hands. Again, they don't know it, but they assume so because a person is not chashin. We don't suspect him, says Rav Papa, Rav Chizda, to come back and eat his meal without washing. Now, what does the phrase anina daite mean? The Hebrew translation of anina daite is daito nikia. Anina is milosha nikius. And what does it mean that a person's das, his knowledge, is clean? And it's a very odd phrase for us to hear in translation in English. But this nikius that we're talking about, when we call it anina daite, is a cleanliness from the perspective of Jewish law. You could say about a person that his behavior in terms of the requirements of Jewish law is clean. He goes clean. Now, why the emphasis on das? Because a person is meticulous about shmiras halacha, about observance of the law because of his das. Meaning, he's constantly aware of the fact that he is in the presence of the Almighty and he wants to fulfill God's will. And such a person who's very meticulous about observing the law is called Nikiya Das. He's got a das, a mindset which is naki. It's clean of any sort of selfish or desires that could lead to violating the will of God. It's naki. It's totally dedicated to the observance of the law, the fulfillment of the will of God. And therefore, no one amongst the Mesubim who are eating together at the Suda are going to start suspecting him that he's eating without washing. Again, even though we're not talking about the original washing, we're talking about the second round of washing in the case where he left and he was Masechet Das. He got into a long discussion for an hour outside of the dining room. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, v'ano afilu lishtos nami. I don't require this public demonstration of washing his hands when he returns, even if he's only drinking liquids. Everybody knows that a Jew is reliable, he's a Naki B'das, and he wants to fulfill the law meticulously, and certainly would not come back to the Suda, even if for the sake of drinking, without first washing his hands. So we have three shitas over here. We have Rav Chizda, and we have Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, and we have in the middle a middle of the road shita. We've got the first shita that says, is I think it's just the anonymous shita of the brisa that a person comes back to the meal, he's got to publicly wash his hands. Then we have Rav Chizda's shita that only when he's coming back to drink, he has to wash his hands. And finally, we have Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak shita that he never has to wash his hands. Again, when I say wash his hands, I mean publicly after he comes inside and rejoins the Mesubim and eats his suda. Okay, all that, which we started on Yom Chamishi of last week, is a digression from the topic of Kodshim, of the Avodas Yom Kippurim, and now we're back to the Mishnah, and here the Mishnah Daf Lamed is going to address the Avodah of Yom Kippurim. Ein adam nichnas la'azara la'avoda afilu tor ad sheyitbal. Now, we're not sure if this is a Doraisa halacha or if it's Takanas Chachamim, but the law requires Tvila when a person, meaning a Kohen, comes in to do the Avodah. He comes into the Azara, he wants to do the Avodah. First, we're going to require him Tvila. Even though it's Tar, we have no reason under the sky to suspect that he contracted Tumah. He needs Tvila. And the Gemara is going to discuss why that's so. Now the Gemara jumps over to the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim and calculates how many times during the course of the day he was Tovel. Amesh Tvilos Vasora Kiddushim Tovel Kohen Gadol Mekadosh Bo Bayom. Now it works like this. Whenever the Kohen would change his begadim, in any direction, either because he took off his big day lavan in order to put on Shmona begadim, or the other way around, whenever he would change his suit of clothing, he would require, number one, kiddush, which means he went over to the kiyar and he was Mekadosh Yadayim Raglayim. And that's called Asara Kiddushin. Because on 5 occasions during the course of Yom Kippurim, the Kohen Gadol would change his begad. And he needed a Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim before he changed his begadim and another one after he changed his begadim. So the first one was like an introduction that paved the way for his changing of his begadim, and the second one was in the aftermath, following up on his shini begadim. He needed another kiddush yadayim raglayim, and we're going to multiply the number 5 by 2 because he needs a kiddush yadayim raglayim before the change of his clothes and after, and he changes his clothes 5 times. Therefore, 10. Has 10 kiddushim during the course of the day. What about tvilos? So although every single time he changes his begadim for the purpose of the avoda, he needs tefillah, and every tefillah before he takes off his clothing, he has to do kiddush yadayim raglayim. After he's tovel and he puts on another begadim, then he has another requirement of kiddush yadayim raglayim, but he doesn't require another tefillah. So one tefillah and two kiddush yadayim raglayim. The kulon bakodesh al beis haparva. Every time that he went to be tovel, he was tovel b'makom kadosh, which is called the beis haparva. We may have touched on this in our introduction, that Parvo was actually a sorcerer, but since he designed, that part of the Beis Hamikdash, which they call it, that mikveh, they call it on his name. It's very strange. But so kol hatfilos eilo yitovel kohen gadol b'makom kadosh. Now, where was this makom kadosh? Al gag lishkas beis haparva. What does this mean? Al gag lishkas beis haparva. It seems that the Gemara is now holding that just 1 second. That Gagos Valios Niskadoshu. We had a sugya in Psachim about the status of the Gagos of the Azora. Does the Kedushas Azora rise up to include even the Gag? So according to one man, the Omer, Gagos Valios Lo Niskadoshu. And here it says in the Mishnah, Kulon Bakodesh al beis parva. Now, if beis parva is on the gag, and I hold gagos lonis kadoshu, then how can the Mishnah says Kulon Bakodesh? So Tosas says that because the Harabayis ascended, it was on an incline going up, there were certain areas that were lower down, others were higher up. The gag of the Beis HaParva was actually the roof of a structure which was much lower down than the Azara. And the gag of the Beis HaParva was on the same level as the Azara. So that the Kedushas Azara now expands to include even the gag of the Beis HaParva. Kevan shegag Beis HaParva yeshovel lekarka Azara, lachein hu niskadesh b'Kedushas Azara. Wow. So this is a wild Mishnah when you think about it. That the Beis HaParva was on top of the roof, and we're holding now Gagos Lonis Kadoshim. And yet Kulam B'Kodesh, the tefillos of the Kohen Gadol were in a Makom Kodesh, on the gag of the Lishkas Beis HaParva. And by the way, the Mishnah derives this from a pasuk. It says, "V'rachates b'saro b'mayim b'makom kadosh." And where was it? On the roof of the Beis HaParva. of the Lichkas Beis HaParva. Now, again, I don't know why the fact that it's on a plateau on the same level, the same height as the Azara, even though it's on the roof of this structure, this Lishka, that gives it the Kedushas Azara. I don't know exactly how that works. That's what it says over here. We didn't get to this. This is sugya later on in Tosfos, Daf Lamed Aleph, Divrei Maskal V'Kulon. Just see where that Tosfos is. Oh, there it is. It's the fourth Tosfos down from the top of Lamed Aleph. V'Kulon B'Kodesh B'Gag Beis HaParva. Tmili V'Gagos V'Alios Lonis Kadoshim. Yishlomar Gag Beis HaParva Yeshave. It was on the same level, the same height. L'Karka Azor. All right. Chutz mizu bilvad. There was one tefillah for Yom Kippur, but before Yom Kippur, which does not require tefillah b'makom kadosh. And that's the first of the 10 tefillos. The first of the 10 tefillos was the tefillah before the akrava of the korban tamid. And the mechayev of tefillah is Yom Kippurim. But here, the chi of tefillah has nothing to do with Yom Kippurim. It's because of the tamid shel shachar. As a general rule, before the akrav of the korban tamid, you needed tefillah b'mikvah. But that chiyuv is not engendered by Yom Kippur. It has nothing to do with Yom Kippur. It applies the whole year round. So therefore, a tefillah that's not related to the avodas Yom Kippurim is called a stam tefillah, and tovel al gabe shar hamayim. He could be tovel in the shar hamayim, and he doesn't need a makom kadosh. Now, where is the shar hamayim? The shar hamayim is located right next to his lishka. And that's a sugya here in Masechet Yoma that we'll get to. So there are two tefillos. There's one tefillah, which is 4 out of 5 of his tefillos, which is on the gag of the Beis HaParva, which has a din of a Makom Kadosh. And then there's the original tefillah, the first of the 5 tefillos, before the avod of the Tamid Shel Shachar. And since that's not integrated or generated by avodas Yom Kippurim, it would apply the whole year round for the korban tamid. Therefore, it doesn't have the special requirement of Yom Kippurim of Makom Kadosh, which is the gag of the Beis HaParva, and the tefillah can take place outside of the Makom Kadosh, which is called the Shar Hamayim B'tzad Lishkasa. And then finally, the last few words in the Mishnah, which we'll close for today, he says with regard to this Seder of Tfilos, the 5 Tfilos, Parsu Sadin Shel Butz, Beino Levein Ha'am. They had to put a private curtain, a curtain that would guarantee privacy. The curtain was made out of linen. That's called Sadin Shel Butz. So that he was concealed from the eye of the spectator. No one actually saw him when he went to the mikveh. Okay, then, so let's make a note of where we got up to. We finished the Mishnah, and we're up to the Gemara. Okay, then. Wishing you a great day.